Serafina Alvarado was 39 years old. When she was escorted off the vineyard, she had called home for 14 years with nothing but a single trunk and the coin she had managed to hide in her petticoat hem. It was her husband's own cousin, Bartolome Alvarado, who cast her out, producing a decades-old family entail that named the nearest male relative sole heir to the Valle Dorado vineyard the moment her husband died, without a living son to inherit it. With $11 to her name, Serafina rode to the far edge of the Rio Verde Valley in California and bought, for $4, the overgrown, long-abandoned cottage that had once belonged to the vineyard's own founder. A crumbling stone house, so choked with wild vines that most in town considered it more a ruin than a dwelling. A purchase everyone called the surest sign, yet that grief had finally taken her reason. They did not know that inside a false fireplace built into that cottage's oldest wall, sealed away since before Serafina's own husband had been born, waited one final wish that would not only return to her everything she had lost, but would finally settle a debt of fairness the whole valley had been quietly owed for 2 generations. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Serafina Alvarado. If you are watching this from a place where you feel like you've been cast out of your own life, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Serafina had been born Serafina Ruiz in the spring of 1851. The daughter of a vaquero named Emiliano Ruiz who had worked the Rio Verde Valley's rangeland since before California joined the Union, and a mother, Dolores, whose own hands had been trained since girlhood in the exacting, patient work of grafting and pruning grapevines on the very land that would one day become the Valle Dorado vineyard. Dolores taught her daughter that a vine, unlike most living things, grew stronger precisely because of the wounds deliberately cut into it each winter, that a vintner who pruned too gently out of misplaced tenderness produced only weak, scattered growth, while one who cut with patient, informed precision coaxed from the same plant a harvest that could sustain a family for generations. A lesson Dolores delivered as much about character as about viticulture. Dolores Ruiz had learned her own craft from an older vintner's widow who employed her briefly as a girl, and she often told Serafina that the woman who taught her insisted a vineyard's true health could never be judged by the beauty of its leaves alone, since a vine might display the most vigorous, attractive foliage in the whole valley, while producing grapes too thin and sour to make a decent wine, and that a truly skilled vintner learned to look past whatever a plant chose to display. Prominently toward the quieter, less visible signs, the color of the wood beneath the bark, the particular give of a root when gently tested, that revealed a vine's actual strength or weakness far more honestly than its outward appearance ever could. Serafina absorbed this lesson so completely across her girlhood that it became, without her ever consciously articulating it as a philosophy, the lens through which she came to judge nearly everything in her adult life, learning to distrust surfaces and to search patiently for the quieter truths beneath them. Emiliano, meanwhile, taught his daughter the particular dignity of work that others often overlooked, reminding her that the vaqueros and laborers who built and maintained the valley's finest properties rarely received public credit for the wealth their hands created, and that a person's worth was measured far more truly in the quality of work done quietly than in the name attached publicly to its result. Serafina grew up moving between these two inheritances, her mother's patient viticultural wisdom and her father's clear-eyed understanding of labor's overlooked value, absorbing both as naturally as she absorbed the valley's dry summer heat and its cold winter fogs rolling in from the coast. She met Tomas Alvarado at 19, the quiet, thoughtful younger son of the family that had owned the Valle Dorado vineyard since his grandfather, Don Anselmo Alvarado, first claimed the land under a Mexican-era grant decades before California statehood, a grant Don Anselmo had spent the remainder of his life transforming from modest rangeland into one of the region's most respected wine estates. Tomas possessed none of the ambitious hunger that seemed to drive his older cousin Bartolome, content instead to work the vines alongside his father and the estate's laborers with a hands-on dedication that Serafina, raised as she was to value quiet competence over public display, found immediately and deeply appealing. Their courtship proceeded slowly across nearly 3 years, complicated somewhat by the elder Alvarado's initial reservations about their son marrying a vaquero's daughter rather than a woman from one of the valley's other landed families. Reservations that softened considerably once Serafina's evident skill with the vines, inherited so directly from her own mother, became apparent during the long visits she made to the estate before her marriage. Serafina and Tomas married in 1873, and across the 14 years that followed, she became, in practice though never in formal title, the estate's most valuable viticulturist, her careful eye for pruning and grafting improving the vineyard's yields in ways that even Tomas's own father acknowledged openly before his death, while Tomas himself managed the estate's broader affairs with the same quiet, steady competence that had first drawn Serafina to him. They were not blessed with children, a sorrow that settled over their marriage gradually rather than all at once. And though this absence troubled them both privately across the years, it did not diminish the genuine partnership they built together in the vineyard's daily rhythms. Serafina's hands shaping the vines themselves while Tomas negotiated contracts and managed the estate's finances with an honesty that earned him considerable respect throughout the valley. It was, by every measure that mattered to either of them, a life of genuine purpose and quiet satisfaction, the kind built slowly across years of shared, patient labor until Tomas's sudden death from a riding accident in the spring of 1887 left Serafina a widow at 36, uncertain for the first time in 14 years what her place in the Valle Dorado's future might actually be. Bartolomé Alvarado arrived at the estate within a week of Tomas's funeral, a cousin Serafina had always regarded with a wary distance given his evident resentment, nursed quietly across years, that his own branch of the family had inherited a smaller and less prosperous adjoining property, while Tomas's father had received the whole of the original Valle Dorado grant. Bartolomé informed Serafina, with a courtesy so brittle it barely concealed the satisfaction beneath it, that he had consulted the family's original founding documents and discovered a clause, buried deep within Don Anselmo's original 1850s land grant paperwork, establishing what he termed a traditional Spanish entail restricting inheritance of the estate to male heirs of the Alvarado bloodline, a clause that, in the absence of any son born to Tomas and Serafina, transferred the entire vineyard directly to Bartolomé as the nearest surviving male relative, regardless of whatever practical role Serafina had played in building the estate's continued prosperity across 14 years of marriage. Serafina demanded to see this supposed entail clause herself, and Bartolomé produced a document that appeared, to her admittedly untrained eye regarding matters of formal land law, genuinely old, its paper yellowed, and its ink faded in a manner consistent with 4 decades' age, though something in its precise, almost too convenient wording struck her as subtly at odds with the plainer, more direct language she had encountered in Don Anselmo's other surviving papers over the years she had lived on the estate, papers that included simple letters to suppliers and plain instructions to the estate's foreman, none of which had ever displayed the formal, almost theatrical legal phrasing Bartolomé's entailed document now presented as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a rancher turned vintner to have composed in his own hand. She raised this observation as delicately as her genuine distress allowed, and Bartolomé's brittle courtesy hardened into something considerably colder, reminding her that a woman with no formal legal training and no living children to anchor her claim held very little standing to challenge a properly aged family document before any territorial court, however genuine her personal grievance might feel to her. In the difficult weeks before Bartolomé's household staff formally arrived to occupy the estate, Serafina had written, with what little hope remained to her, to a territorial attorney in the county seat, whose name a sympathetic neighbor supplied, describing the entailed document's suspicious wording and asking whether any formal challenge might be mounted before the transfer of ownership became final. The attorney's reply, arriving only days before Bartolomé's own deadline, offered little practical comfort. explaining that without considerably more concrete evidence than her own instinct regarding the document's phrasing, no court in that era was likely to set aside a document appearing genuinely aged and properly executed, however unjust its consequences might feel to the widow left behind by its provisions. It was a bitter lesson in the particular helplessness of a woman whose 14 years of genuine labor building an estate's prosperity carried, in the law's eyes, considerably less weight than a single piece of yellowed paper, and Serafina absorbed it, as she absorbed most difficult truths, without outward complaint, though it cost her privately a great deal to accept. He was, in the narrowest technical sense the law of that era generally recognized, likely correct, and within 6 weeks, Serafina Alvarado found herself standing outside the vineyard she had spent 14 years helping to build, watching Bartolomé's own household staff begin settling into rooms she had once called home. She did not immediately leave the Rio Verde Valley, though several old family friends gently suggested she might find an easier welcome starting fresh somewhere her circumstances weren't quite so publicly known, because leaving would have meant abandoning both her husband's grave and the persistent, nagging conviction that Bartolomé's entailed document did not tell the whole truth of Don Anselmo's original intentions for the land he had spent his life building. It was while making quiet inquiries at the county recorder's office, hoping against reasonable expectation to find some surviving record that might support her suspicion, that she learned the old Alvarado family cottage, the modest stone dwelling where Don Anselmo himself had lived during the vineyard's earliest, most difficult years before he built the grander estate house that Bartolomé now occupied, was to be sold that very week for whatever anyone would offer, the county having grown weary of the abandoned structure sitting untaxed and unclaimed on its rolls for the better part of 2 decades since Don Anselmo's own death. Serafina felt something shift in her chest at the mention of that cottage, a place she remembered visiting only rarely during her marriage, since Tomas's family had largely abandoned it once the grander estate house was completed, and though $4 represented nearly half of everything she now possessed in the world, she resolved almost immediately to bid on the property herself, drawn by some combination of genuine sentiment for her husband's family history and a stubborn, still forming instinct that Don Anselmo's original home might hold some clue to the truth Bartolomé's document seemed determined to obscure. The old cottage, when Serafina walked out to see it the following morning, stood exactly as forsaken as 2 decades of neglect could make it, its stone walls nearly swallowed beneath a wild tangle of untended grapevines that had crept up from the surrounding fields to claim the structure as their own, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated debris, its windows either shattered or boarded entirely. When the county auctioneer opened bidding at the courthouse steps 2 days later, the gathered crowd, which included several who recognized Serafina and regarded her circumstances with the particular blend of pity and discomfort small communities often reserve for a woman recently and publicly dispossessed, offered nothing beyond a few muttered comments about wasted money. And Serafina's bid of $4 drew exactly the kind of unkind, quiet laughter she had half expected. She signed the deed with a steady hand regardless, and walked the 2 miles back toward the cottage that same afternoon with the paper folded carefully into her coat, uncertain whether she had just done something wise or something the whole valley would soon confirm as entirely foolish. She spent her first days at the cottage simply clearing enough space to shelter from the weather, cutting back the wild vines that had grown through several of the window openings, and salvaging what usable wood she could from a collapsed lean-to nearby to patch the worst gaps in the roof, working from dawn until the light failed each evening with a determination that surprised even her, since some part of her recognized, even before she fully understood why, that this small stone cottage represented not merely shelter, but a kind of return to the very beginning of everything the Alvarado name had built. The wild grapevines themselves, she noticed as she cleared them, were not the common rootstock planted throughout the newer sections of the estate, but an older, hardier variety her mother had once described to her as among the very first plantings Don Anselmo had established, vines that had survived 30 years of complete neglect through nothing but their own stubborn resilience. A detail Serafina found herself returning to more than once as she worked, some part of her recognizing in those surviving vines a reflection of her own circumstances that she could not yet fully articulate. It was on her fourth day, while she was clearing decades of accumulated debris from around the cottage's modest stone fireplace, running her hands along its construction the way her mother had once taught her to test a vine's health by feel rather than sight alone, that she noticed the fireplace's rear wall, unlike the rest of its otherwise plain construction, had been built with an unusual double thickness, a detail she might easily have overlooked had her fingers not caught, quite by accident, a slight give in one particular stone near its base that did not match the solid resistance of the stones surrounding it. Serafina worked that stone loose with a borrowed chisel and the patient, careful attention her mother had trained into her hands decades before and found, behind it, a shallow cavity built directly into the fireplace's false rear wall, containing a leather document case gone brittle with age and a small wooden box whose lid, when she pried it open, revealed a simple silver locket alongside several folded papers protected by a wrapping of oiled cloth that had kept them remarkably dry across what must have been decades of concealment. Serafina carried both items to the small fire she built that evening in the cottage's other, more usable hearth, and began reading by lamplight, discovering that the papers within the leather case constituted the genuine final will and testament of Don Anselmo Alvarado himself, dated some 3 years before his death and executed, according to its own careful language, specifically to supersede and replace an earlier document he described, with evident regret, as having been drafted hastily and under considerable family pressure during a period of serious illness from which he had not expected to recover. Don Anselmo's true will described, in a hand grown shaky with age but still legible, his genuine wishes for the Valle Dorado estate following his death, wishes considerably more expansive and considerably more generous than the simple male line inheritance Bartolome's document described. Serafina understood, reading these pages by lamplight, that Don Anselmo had written this document not merely as a legal instrument, but as something closer to a confession, describing in considerable and painful detail the particular winter when the drought's full severity became clear, when he had gathered the laboring families together himself rather than sending word through an overseer, and had promised them plainly, in language his own will quoted directly, that should the vineyard survive, to see prosperity again, that prosperity would belong to everyone whose hands had kept it alive through the crisis, not merely to the family whose name happened to appear on the original land grant. Don Anselmo's will explained that during the vineyard's most difficult early years, a severe drought in the late 1850s had nearly ruined the fledgling estate entirely, and that it was only through the extraordinary loyalty of the vaqueros, laborers, and their families working the land, several of whom had gone months without full wages while continuing to tend the vines through the crisis on nothing more than Don Anselmo's promise of eventual fair treatment, that the vineyard survived at all to become the prosperous estate it later grew into. In gratitude for this loyalty, and in recognition that the estate's continued success depended as much on these families' patient labor as on the Alvarado name itself, Don Anselmo's genuine will established a formal provision granting each of the founding laboring families, identified by name across several careful pages, a permanent share in the estate's ownership and profits, to be honored by whichever Alvarado descendant eventually inherited primary control of the property, a provision considerably at odds with the exclusive male line entail Bartolome had presented to Serafina as the estate's founding law. Serafina found herself weeping quietly over the silver locket more than once as she read deeper into that first night, understanding that Don Anselmo had chosen to hide alongside his true wishes for the estate the one private token he still possessed of his late wife's memory, as though he had wanted whoever eventually found the will to understand it not merely as a legal document, but as the genuine, heartfelt wish of a man who had loved both his family and the people who labored alongside them. A wish he had been cruelly prevented from honoring openly in his own lifetime. The will's final pages explained why this document had never taken legal effect, describing how Don Anselmo's own eldest son, Bartolome's grandfather, deeply opposed to sharing the family's prosperity with laboring families he considered beneath serious consideration, had discovered his father's intentions during the old man's final illness and had, according to Don Anselmo's own anguished account written in his final lucid weeks, coerced him through a combination of manipulation and outright threat into publicly affirming the earlier, harsher document instead, the very entail Bartolome now relied upon. While Don Anselmo secretly drafted this true final will and hid it, along with his late wife's silver locket, as a private token of the honesty he could no longer display openly, in the one place he trusted his son would never think to search, the modest cottage the family had long since abandoned for grander quarters. Serafina sat with that will for the better part of 2 days, understanding with a slowly dawning clarity that she now held not merely a personal vindication against Bartolome's fraudulent inheritance claim, but proof of a fairness Don Anselmo himself had genuinely intended and been prevented from honoring. A fairness that would restore not only her own rightful place at Valle Dorado, but formal ownership shares to the descendants of laboring families who had built the estate's prosperity with their own hands and received, across 2 generations, no lasting recognition for it whatsoever. She understood, too, that Bartolome's own claim rested on a document his own grandfather had coerced into being through what amounted to elder abuse of the dying Don Anselmo, a fraud considerably more serious than the simple legal technicality he had presented to her so coldly following Tomas's death. She did not act rashly, understanding that a will discovered decades after the fact, however genuine its language appeared, would require considerable corroborating evidence before any court would set aside a document that had stood as the estate's governing law for nearly 30 years. Through the following weeks, even as she continued repairing the cottage and began cultivating a small portion of the wild vines still growing strong despite decades of neglect, Serafina spent her evenings researching what she could of the drought years Don Anselmo's will described, seeking out descendants of the original laboring families named in its pages, several of whom still lived and worked in the valley, tending vines for wages on properties including, with a bitter irony, she noted, quietly, the very Valle Dorado estate Bartolome now controlled. It was through these careful inquiries that Serafina located Guadalupe Feliz, an elderly woman whose own grandfather had been among the vaqueros named directly in Don Anselmo's will, and who possessed, passed down through her family across 2 generations, her grandfather's own recollection of a private promise Don Anselmo had made to the assembled laborers during the drought's worst months. A promise of eventual shared ownership that the family had always understood, without documentation to prove it, as one more kindly gesture from a dying era rather than any binding legal commitment. Guadalupe's testimony, combined with the will itself and a subsequent search of county records that revealed, buried in an old probate file no one had examined closely in decades, correspondence between Don Anselmo's attorney and the elder Bartolome, describing considerable pressure to finalize the estate's inheritance documents during the old man's final illness, provided Serafina with precisely the corroborating evidence she needed to bring her claim before a proper court with genuine confidence. Guadalupe Feliz proved, in the weeks that followed their first meeting, a steadier ally than Serafina had any right to expect from a woman whose own family had suffered decades of quiet disappointment over a promise never formally honored, traveling with her twice to speak with other laboring families named in Don Anselmo's will and reminding each of them, with a patience Serafina came to admire deeply, that the truth they carried forward together mattered regardless of whether Bartolome's continued hostility made pursuing it feel safe or wise. It was Guadalupe, too, who first suggested that Serafina approach Judge Ferris specifically rather than the county's other, more traditionally minded magistrates, having heard through her own family's connections that the judge possessed an unusual reputation for weighing evidence on its genuine merits rather than deferring automatically to whichever party carried the more established name. Word inevitably reached Bartolome Alvarado that his cousin's widow had been making unusual inquiries about the estate's founding history and the fate of its original laboring families, and he rode out to the old cottage himself on a warm autumn afternoon, his manner carrying none of the brittle courtesy he had shown at Tomas's funeral, but instead an unmistakable hostility that told Serafina, more plainly than any words could have, exactly how much he understood might be at stake should the truth of his own grandfather's fraud become known throughout the valley. He warned her plainly that continuing to pursue baseless rumors about ancient family history would only invite considerably more serious trouble upon a woman already reduced to a crumbling cottage, a threat Serafina met with the same patient composure her mother had once brought to the careful, unhurried work of grafting a stubborn vine. Understanding that a woman who had already lost everything Bartolome could threaten to take possessed, in that very loss, an unexpected freedom from his usual leverage. The wider valley, when whispers eventually spread that the dispossessed widow was pursuing some manner of claim against Bartolome's inheritance, proved initially skeptical, since the Alvarado family's respectability had gone largely unquestioned throughout the region for decades, and it seemed, to most who heard the rumors, far more plausible that grief had led Serafina towards some manner of desperate fantasy than that the valley's most established Vineyard family had built its continued prosperity upon a fraud committed against a dying man 2 generations before. Several of Serafina's old acquaintances grew cautious in her company, uncertain whether associating with her invited Bartolome's displeasure, and even the local priest, a man who had known both Tomas and Serafina across the whole of their marriage, counseled her gently during confession to consider whether her grief might be leading her toward conclusions the evidence did not truly support. A suggestion Serafina received with outward patience, though it cost her considerable private doubt in the harder moments of that long, uncertain season. Doubt she worked through, as she worked through most things, by returning again and again to her mother's old conviction that a vine's true strength revealed itself only to those patient enough to keep testing it long after a casual glance would have already moved on. What finally shifted the balance in Serafina's favor was the discovery, during her continued research at the county archive, of Don Anselmo's original attorney's personal papers, donated to the Historical Society decades earlier by his own descendants and never previously connected to the Alvarado inheritance dispute. Papers that included a private letter written by the attorney himself shortly before his own death, expressing considerable guilt over having witnessed what he described plainly as coercion during Don Anselmo's final illness, and confirming that a second, more generous will had indeed existed before the elder Bartolome's pressure produced the harsher document that ultimately governed the estate's inheritance. Serafina carried this letter, along with Don Anselmo's recovered will and Guadalupe Feliz's family testimony, before Judge Rosalind Ferris, one of the few women admitted to practice law in California during that era and now serving as a respected arbiter in the county's more complex civil disputes, laying the full case before her with the same patient, careful attention Serafina brought to every vine she had ever tended. Judge Ferris, recognizing the unusual weight of evidence spanning multiple independent sources across 2 generations, spent the better part of 2 months verifying the authenticity of both the recovered will and the attorney's corroborating letter before announcing that the matter warranted formal reconsideration of the estate's governing inheritance documents. The hearing that followed, held in the valley's largest public hall because word of the dispute had spread throughout the region within days, exposed before the gathered crowd the full account of Don Anselmo's coerced final years, his genuine wishes for the laboring families who had saved his estate from ruin, and his own son's fraud in suppressing those wishes for the sake of exclusive family control. Judge Ferris ruled that the recovered will represented Don Anselmo's authentic final intentions, that Bartolome's inheritance under the earlier, coerced document was void as against both law and basic conscience, and that ownership of the Valle Dorado estate would be restored according to Don Anselmo's genuine wishes, with Serafina recognized as primary heir through her marriage to Tomas, and formal ownership shares distributed to the documented descendants of the original founding laboring families exactly as the recovered will had specified. Serafina could have claimed, in the aftermath of that ruling, sole and complete ownership of the restored estate for herself, understanding that her marriage to Tomas gave her considerably stronger legal standing than any competing claim Bartolome might still attempt. Instead, standing before the gathered valley in the same plain dress she had worn to bid $4 on a crumbling cottage months before, Serafina insisted that Don Anselmo's original vision be honored in full, that Guadalupe Feliz and every other descendant of the founding laboring families receive their rightful ownership shares immediately, and that the estate itself be renamed formally to honor both Don Anselmo's true intentions and the generations of overlooked labor that had built its prosperity, a decision the valley would speak of for years afterward as revealing more genuine character than any accusation against Bartolome ever could have. In the months that followed, the Valle Dorado estate was reorganized precisely as Don Anselmo's recovered will had specified, its profits shared among the founding family's descendants for the first time in the estate's history, and the old stone cottage where Serafina had discovered the truth was carefully restored rather than abandoned again, becoming a small museum of sorts dedicated to the valley's full history, laborers and landowners both, rather than the single-family narrative the estate had promoted for 2 generations. Guadalupe Feliz herself, whose grandfather's quiet memory of Don Anselmo's original promise had proven so essential to Serafina's case, was invited to speak at the cottage's formal reopening, and her account of a promise carried faithfully across 3 generations without any document to prove it, offered to the gathered crowd of both landowning and laboring families, became, in the years that followed, the story the valley told most often when explaining why the restored estate bore a small plaque naming every founding family rather than the Alvarado name alone. Bartolome Alvarado, his fraudulent claim exposed before the entire valley, departed the region within the year, his considerable personal shame, Serafina came to believe, a more fitting justice than any court could have formally imposed upon a man whose own grandfather's cruelty toward a dying father had finally, after 2 long generations, been brought fully into the light. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, that Serafina Alvarado stood outside the vineyard she had spent 14 years helping to build with $11 and a single trunk, cast out by a cousin who believed a widow's devoted labor carried no weight against a conveniently aged document. She spent 4 of those dollars on a crumbling, vine-choked cottage the whole valley had long since written off as a worthless ruin, because some deep, inherited instinct, passed down from a mother who trusted the patient work of the vine, and a father who understood that overlooked labor eventually demands its due, told her that very little in this world is truly ruined beyond recovery. Behind that false fireplace waited not a fortune meant for her alone, but one dying man's final, genuine wish for fairness, suppressed for 2 generations by his own son's cruelty. And in bringing that wish finally into the light, Serafina proved that the truest inheritance a person can claim is not a name or a bloodline, but the patient, honest fairness that name was always meant to protect. She often said, in the years that followed, whenever a visitor to the restored cottage asked how she had known to trust her own instinct about a fireplace that looked, to any ordinary eye, like nothing more than plain old stonework, that she had simply done what her mother taught her to do with any vine whose true condition wasn't visible from a casual glance, which was to test it patiently with her own hands rather than trust its outward appearance alone, and what her father taught her about labor too easily dismissed by those who never had to perform it themselves, which was to look twice at whatever the world called worthless before agreeing with its judgment. Serafina Alvarado spent the remainder of her years at Valle Dorado, tending its vines alongside the very families whose ownership she had helped restore, respected at last not as a dispossessed widow to be pitied, but as the woman whose patient faith in one final hidden wish had given an entire valley back both its rightful inheritance and its honest history. A woman whose example the younger daughters of the Feliz and other founding families came to study closely, learning from her the same patient grafting techniques her own mother had once taught her beside these very rows of vines decades before. What if the truth you had been searching for your entire life was hidden behind a wall that everyone else had stopped looking at? What if the person who had been forgotten by an entire family had actually left behind one final request? And what if that request wasn't about money? It wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. For decades, Serafina's name slowly disappeared from the conversations of the people who once knew her. Her story was filed away. Her pain became history. And eventually, almost everyone believed there was nothing left to uncover. But they were wrong. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes it waits. Serafina had lived through the kind of rejection that changes a person. She had been pushed away, misunderstood, and eventually cast out. And perhaps the cruelest part wasn't simply being abandoned. It was watching the world continue as though she had never mattered. Years passed, then decades. People moved on. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. And the story surrounding Serafina became something people repeated without questioning. She was difficult. She was responsible for what happened. She had been given her chance. That was the version of events that survived. But there was one problem. Nobody had gone back to look at the evidence. Nobody had asked the question that mattered most. What if everyone had been wrong? Then, years later, someone found something that changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic confession. There was no courtroom, no newspaper headline, no grand announcement. It was something much quieter. A forgotten record. A document that had survived while the people who created it were long gone. And inside that record was a detail that didn't fit the story everyone had accepted for generations. Suddenly, Serafina's past looked different. The accusations against her didn't seem as certain. The decisions made against her didn't seem as fair. And the silence surrounding her began to feel less like coincidence and more like something that had been carefully preserved. But there was still another question. If Serafina had been treated unfairly, why had she never been able to correct the record herself? The answer made the story even more heartbreaking. Serafina had left behind something more powerful than an argument. She had left behind a wish. Not a demand for punishment. Not a request for revenge. She wanted the truth to be known. That was it. She wanted someone, someday, to look at what happened and finally say, "This wasn't fair." Think about that for a moment. After everything she had endured, Serafina wasn't asking the world to destroy the people who had hurt her. She was asking the world to remember her correctly. And that distinction matters. Because sometimes justice isn't about making someone suffer. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to let a lie become history. But Serafina didn't live long enough to see the truth fully uncovered. Her generation passed. Then another generation came. The people who knew the original story disappeared one by one. And still, that unanswered question remained. For almost 2 generations, what had happened to Serafina existed in the shadows, until someone finally became curious enough to investigate. Piece by piece, the old story began falling apart. A forgotten document here, a missing detail there, a contradiction that had been ignored for years. And eventually, something remarkable happened. The person searching for answers realized that Serafina hadn't been forgotten completely. She had been waiting for someone patient enough to look deeper, waiting for someone honest enough to question what everyone else accepted, and most importantly, waiting for someone willing to finish what she had started. That's what makes Serafina's story so powerful. Because being cast out is not the same thing as being finished. Being misunderstood is not the same thing as being guilty. And being forgotten is not the same thing as never having mattered. There are people whose stories end without witnesses. People whose reputations are destroyed by rumors. People who lose everything while the world moves on. But sometimes, years later, someone opens an old box. Someone reads an old letter. Someone questions an old story, and suddenly, a voice that had been silent for generations speaks again. Seraphina's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her final wish survived because someone eventually cared enough to listen. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Fairness can be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. So if there's something in your own life that feels unresolved, something you were told to forget, something everyone else decided wasn't worth investigating, remember, Seraphina, you don't always get answers immediately. Sometimes the truth takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. And sometimes, unbelievably, it can take generations. But that doesn't mean the truth has stopped existing. It may simply be waiting for the right person to find it. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered the truth about something that everyone around you had already written off? Maybe it was a family story, a misunderstanding, an injustice, or simply something you knew wasn't right, even when everyone else told you to let it go. Tell us your story in the comments. And if Seraphina's story reminded you that being cast out is never the same as being finished, share this video with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about forgotten people, hidden truths, and the moments when justice finally finds its way home. Until next time, stay close.